The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, turning Gratiot Avenue into a river of black asphalt and reflected neon. From the second-floor window of the Detroit Italian-American bakery, Joseph Zerilli watched water pool around the storm drains, watched it overflow onto the sidewalks where men in sodden overcoats hurried past with newspapers held uselessly over their heads. The glass was cold against his fingertips. Below, a black Packard idled at the curb, exhaust mixing with the rain-heavy air. Behind him, the office smelled of espresso and fresh bread from the ovens downstairs. A good smell. An honest smell, if such a thing existed anymore in this city. His cousin Bill Tocco sat at the desk, fountain pen scratching across a ledger, occasionally pausing to tap ash from his cigarette into a crystal tray. The numbers told their own story, bakery receipts on one side, the real accounting on the other. 23 loans, outstanding in the Eastern Market District alone. Principal amounts ranging from $500 to $15,000. Weekly vigorous running 25 to 50%, compounding if the debtor missed even a single payment. Giacaloni's late, Bill said without looking up. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man stating weather conditions. Joseph checked his watch. 3:17. Tony Jack had been due at 3. The boy, though at 28 he was hardly a boy anymore, had a gift for intimidation that Joseph had recognized early. Where other enforcers relied on volume and theatrics, Tony Jack possessed something rarer, the ability to communicate violence through absolute stillness. A man who could stand in a doorway and make another man's bladder loosen without uttering a syllable. "He'll be here," Joseph said. He moved away from the window, sat in the leather chair opposite Bill's desk. The chair creaked under his weight. He was 49 years old, heavier now than in his bootlegging days, the good life of Grosser Point beginning to show in his waistline, despite Josephine's attempts to moderate his portions. His suit was charcoal gabardine, custom-tailored on Woodward Avenue, the fabric holding a faint trace of his wife's perfume from when she brushed past him that morning. Bill closed the ledger, lit a fresh cigarette from the dying ember of his last. The Terracini way waste nothing, not even fire. The Polak on Russell Street, he said. Stanislaus, something. He's 12 weeks behind. How much? Started with $2,000. Now he's into us for $6,800. Joseph did the arithmetic in his head. The original loan had been for the Polak's restaurant supply business, meat and produce for the Polish joints along Russell and Canfield. 2,000 at 40% weekly meant 800 a week in vigorish alone. 12 weeks unpaid, compounding. The man had probably stopped sleeping months ago. He have anything left? Joseph asked. The business. His house in Hamtramck. A 46 Chevrolet he drives. Family? Wife. 3 kids. Youngest is 4. Joseph nodded slowly. He reached for the coffee cup on Bill's desk, found it cold, set it down again. Outside, the rain continued its percussion against the window glass. Somewhere in the building below, someone was singing. One of the bakery workers, voice muffled by walls and distance, some Neapolitan song about the sea. Send Giacaloni when he gets here, Joseph said. Tell the Pollock we'll take the business. He can stay on as manager, we'll pay him a salary. Enough to feed his family. The house and the car he keeps. But he works for us now. Bill made a note. He won't like it. He'll like it better than what happens if he refuses. The door opened without a knock. Angelo Melli, water-beaded on his fedora, raincoat dark across the shoulders. He shook himself like a dog, hung the coat on the rack by the door. Angelo was 46, built like a fire hydrant, with hands that had broken more bones than Joseph cared to count. He'd been there in 20 when they put down John Batali, had been there through every war and truce since. Loyal as sunrise, which is why Joseph kept him close. "Tony Jack's downstairs," Angelo said. "Brought someone with him. Who?" "Teamster. Says his name is Hoffer." "What's he want?" Joseph asked. Angelo shrugged, water dripping from his hat brim onto the hardwood floor. "Says he's got a proposition. Business opportunity." Joseph considered this. The Teamsters had been sniffing around the produce markets for months, trying to organize the truck drivers who hauled goods from the Eastern Market to restaurants and grocers across the city. Some of those drivers worked for companies that owed Joseph money. Some of those companies were fronts Joseph controlled outright. The intersection of interests was inevitable. "Bring them up," he said. Angelo disappeared. Bill stubbed out his cigarette, straightened the ledger on his desk, adjusted his tie. Preparing for theatre, though his face remained blank as plaster. Joseph stood, moved to the window again, hands clasped behind his back. Let them see him in silhouette against the grey light. Let them come to him. Footsteps on the stairs. The door opened. Tony Jack entered first, 6 feet tall, shoulders that filled his overcoat, face like something carved from granite and left unfinished. Behind him came a shorter man, compact, with reddish-brown hair slicked back and eyes that moved constantly, cataloguing everything. Hoffer wore a brown suit that had seen better days, tie slightly askew, shoes that needed polish. "Working-class costume," Joseph noted. "Deliberate. Mr. Zerilli," Tony Jack said. His voice was gravel wrapped in silk. "This is Jimmy Hoffer, local 2299. Joseph turned from the window, extended his hand. Hoffer's grip was firm, dry despite the rain. His eyes met Joseph's without flinching, not challenging, but not deferential either. Measuring. "Mr. Hoffer," Joseph said, "you're wet. Coffee?" "I'm fine." "Sit." They arranged themselves, Joseph behind the desk now. Bill standing by the filing cabinet, Angelo near the door. Tony Jack remained standing behind Hoffer's chair, a mountain in a Chesterfield coat. Hoffer sat with his hands on his knees, leaning slightly forward. Eager, Joseph thought, hungry. "You organize truck drivers," Joseph said. "I organize workers," Hoffer corrected. "Men who break their backs moving other people's goods. Men who deserve a fair wage and safe conditions." Noble, practical. A man who can't feed his family doesn't care about your loading schedule. A man who feels valued will drive through a blizzard to make your delivery. Joseph nodded. "And what does this have to do with me? I run a bakery." Hoffer smiled, quick, knowing. "You run a lot of things, Mr. Zerilli, including some of the biggest trucking operations in the Eastern Market. I'm here to propose we work together." "I already work with the drivers. They drive. I pay them." "You pay them shit," Hoffer said, and the room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Tony Jack shifted his weight, a glacier preparing to carve. But Joseph raised one hand, barely, and the mountain stilled. "Continue," Joseph said. Hoffer leaned back now, more comfortable. "Here's what I see. You've got loans out to half the produce companies in Detroit. When they can't pay, you take over their operations. Smart business. But you've got a problem. You need those trucks rolling, and the drivers know they've got you by the balls. One wildcat strike and your tomatoes rot on the dock. Say you're offering to prevent strikes. I'm offering to make sure the drivers are happy enough that strikes don't happen. We organize them, negotiate contracts, handle their grievances. In exchange, you get labor peace. Guaranteed. And what do you get? Union dues. Recognition. A seat at the table when decisions get made about who hauls what and when. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a streetcar rattled past, bell clanging. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the light through the window turning from grey to charcoal as afternoon bled toward evening. He could smell the yeast from the ovens, could hear the distant clatter of baking sheets being stacked. "You're asking me to help you build a union," he said finally, "a union that will then demand higher wages from my companies. I'm asking you to invest in stability. Yeah, wages go up a little, but you know what you're paying, and you know the trucks roll. No surprises. No disruptions. And when you need a favor, a driver who doesn't ask questions about what's in the back of the truck, a loading dock that stays open late without paperwork, we're there." Bill spoke for the first time. "And if we say no?" Hoffa's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you get strikes, lots of them. Funny how these things happen when management won't negotiate in good faith." Tony Jack's hand moved to his coat pocket, but Joseph shook his head. "Not yet." He studied Hoffa, the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his breathing. This was a man who'd been in fights, who'd taken beatings and given them. Not mafia, but not soft either. Useful, if properly directed. "How much do you need?" Joseph asked. "For what?" "To organize the Eastern market." "How much money?" Hoffa blinked. He'd expected more resistance. 10,000 would get us started. Organizers, office space, legal fees when the companies fight back. 15,000, Joseph said, at 25% weekly. Now Hoffa's smile was genuine. "That's a hell of an interest rate." "That's the cost of doing business with me. You want stability? This is what it costs. You pay on time, we're partners, you miss a payment." He gestured vaguely toward Tony Jack. Hoffa looked at Tony Jack, then back to Joseph. "I'll need time to build the membership. Can't pay that kind of vig until we've got dues coming in." 6 months grace period, Joseph said. "Interest accrues but doesn't compound. After 6 months you pay weekly or we have a different conversation." "Deal." Hoffa stood, extended his hand again. Joseph remained seated, made Hoffa lean across the desk. Power in small gestures. "One more thing," Joseph said as their hands met. "You work with us, you work only with us. I hear you're taking money from anyone else, management, other families, the feds, and the deal is void. Understood?" Yes, I understood. After Hoffa and Tony Jack left, the office felt larger, emptier. Angelo moved to the window, watching them climb into a mud-spattered Ford on the street below. Bill lit another cigarette, the match flared bright in the dimming room. "You trust him?" Bill asked. "No." "Then why give him the money?" Joseph stood, stretched, felt his spine pop. "Because he's going to win. The unions are coming whether we like it or not. Roosevelt saw to that. Better to own a piece of the Teamsters now than fight them later when they're strong enough to hurt us. And if he crosses us, then Tony Jack earns his money. Angelo turned from the window. The Polak on Russell Street. You want me to go with Tony when he collects? No. Send Vito and Sam. Tell them to be polite. We're taking his business, not his life. I want him grateful, not terrified. Grateful, Angelo repeated, the word foreign in his mouth. Grateful men work harder. Terrified men make mistakes. Joseph moved toward the coat rack, shrugged into his overcoat. The fabric was still damp from this morning. Besides, we need him to run that business properly. Can't do that if his hands are shaking every time someone walks through the door. Bill closed the ledger, locked it in the desk drawer, going home. Josephine's making osso buco. I'm late already. He descended the narrow stairs, the smell of bread growing stronger. In the bakery proper, the evening shift was cleaning. Flour dust hanging in the air like fog, the big mixers silent and gleaming. Old Salvatore, who'd worked the ovens since 23, nodded as Joseph passed. Joseph nodded back. Respect and silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick, reflecting the neon signs of the bars and restaurants along Gratio. Joseph's Cadillac was parked in the alley behind the bakery, a 48 Series 62 in midnight blue. He unlocked it, slid behind the wheel, sat for a moment before starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and he stared through the windshield at the brick wall opposite. 23 loans outstanding. The Hoffer investment made 24. Each one a thread in a web that stretched across the city, produced companies, trucking firms, restaurants, blind pigs that operated under the pretense of private clubs. Each thread vibrating with the weight of debt, of obligation, of fear. He built this web carefully over 18 years, since the day they'd ended the Gianolo Vitale War and divided the city into territories. The web had held. It had grown. It had made him wealthy enough to live in Grosse Pointe, to send his children to good schools, to wear suits that cost more than his father had earned in a year breaking rocks in Terracini. But the web required constant maintenance, constant attention. A loan unpaid here, a challenge to authority there. Each one had to be addressed immediately, decisively. Show weakness once and the whole structure could collapse. He'd seen it happen to John Vitale, to Chester Lamar. Men who'd believed their reputations would carry them, who'd grown lazy or sentimental. The streets had swallowed them. He started the engine, pulled out of the alley onto Gratio. The drive to Grosse Pointe took 20 minutes in light traffic. He followed the familiar route, Gratio to East Jefferson, then along the river where the houses grew larger and the streets grew quieter. The rain had washed the city clean, left everything smelling of wet concrete and autumn leaves. At home, the lights were on in every window. The house was Tudor revival, 3 stories, set back from the street behind a manicured lawn that Josephine insisted on despite the expense. Joseph pulled into the circular driveway, killed the engine. Through the front window he could see movement, his wife in the kitchen probably. The children would be upstairs doing homework. Anthony, 14 now, struggling with geometry. Rosalie, 11, reading everything she could get her hands on. Normal children doing normal things in a normal house. He sat in the car for another minute, letting the day drain out of him. The Polak with his 6,800 in debt. Hoffer with his hungry eyes and his union dreams. The endless arithmetic of vigorish and compound interest, of broken men and broken businesses. He compartmentalized it all, packed it away into some interior room where Josephine and the children couldn't see it. Then he got out of the car, climbed the front steps, opened the door. "Joseph," Josephine called from the kitchen. "You're late. The osso buco is getting cold." He hung his coat, his hat, checked his reflection in the hall mirror, adjusted his tie, smoothed his hair. The face that looked back at him was respectable, prosperous, a successful businessman, a devoted family man. "Coming," he called back, and he went to dinner. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of diesel and river water, Joseph stood in the back office of a produce warehouse on Orleans Street. The office was barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, walls lined with invoices and shipping manifests, a calendar from a fertilizer company showing a blonde in a swimsuit. The warehouse beyond the closed door hummed with activity, forklifts beeping, men shouting, the constant rumble of trucks backing up to loading docks. Across the desk sat Martin Kowalski, the Polak from Russell Street. He'd lost weight since Joseph had last seen him, face gaunt, eyes sunken. His hands trembled as he signed the papers Bill Tocco had prepared, transfer of business ownership, employment contract, promissory note for the remaining debt to be paid from his salary over the next 10 years. "You understand the terms?" Bill asked, his voice neutral. Kowalski nodded. He didn't look up from the papers. "You'll manage the day-to-day operations. Purchasing, staffing, deliveries. You'll report weekly to Mr. Melly here." Bill gestured to Angelo, who stood by the door like a monument to consequence. "You'll receive a salary of $60 a week. After taxes and debt service, you'll take home about 32. "That's not enough," Kowalski whispered. "My rent alone is." "Your rent is 28 a month," Joseph said. He'd been silent until now, letting Bill handle the details. "You'll manage. Your wife can take in sewing. Your oldest boy is what, 13? Old enough to work after school." Kowalski's hands stopped trembling. They clenched into fists on the desk. "You're taking everything." "I'm taking what you owe me. You borrowed $2,000. You knew the terms. You chose not to pay." "I couldn't pay. The summer was slow. The heat spoiled half my inventory." "Not my problem." Joseph's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You borrowed money to solve a problem. The money created a different problem. Now we're solving that problem. You still have your house, your family, your life. Many men in your position have less." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Kowalski's fists unclenched. He picks up the pen, signed the final page. Bill collected the papers, tapped them into alignment, slid them into a leather folder. "Good," Bill said. "Mr. Melly will be by Friday to review the books, make sure everything is in order." They left Kowalski sitting at the desk, staring at his empty hands. Outside, the warehouse floor was chaos. Men in work clothes hauling crates of lettuce and tomatoes, a forklift nearly colliding with a hand truck, someone screaming about a short count on the celery. Joseph walked through it all without hurrying, nodding to workers who recognized him, ignoring those who didn't. On the street, Angelo's Buick was parked in a loading zone. They climbed in, Joseph in back, Bill in front, Angelo behind the wheel. The car smelled of cigars and aftershave. 23rd business this year, Bill said as Angelo pulled into traffic. "We're running out of people to manage them all." "Promote from within," Joseph said. "Find the smart ones, the hungry ones. Give them a piece of the action, make them loyal. Like Hoffer. They drove in silence for a while, following East Jefferson toward downtown. The river was choppy today, whitecaps visible through the gaps between buildings. A freighter was making its way upstream, probably heading for the Ford plant in River Rouge. The city was rebuilding after the war, new construction everywhere, veterans returning to factory jobs, the suburbs spreading outward like a slow explosion. Tony Jack called this morning, Angelo said. Says the Teamsters organized the warehouse on Russell Street. Kowalski's drivers voted 90% in favor. Expected, Joseph said. Hoffer's moving fast. He's asking for another 10,000. Says he's ready to move on the downriver trucking companies. Joseph watched the river slide past. A loan to Hoffer, a loan to Kowalski, loans to a dozen other desperate men across the city. Each loan a hook, each hook connected to a line, each line leading back to him. The web grew. Give it to him, he said. Same terms, and tell him I want a meeting next month. Time to discuss the long-term arrangement. You think he'll try to cut us out once he's established? Bill asked. He'll think about it. But he's smart enough to know he needs us more than we need him. The Teamsters can organize, but they can't enforce, not the way we can. Angelo grunted agreement. They passed through downtown, past the grand hotels and department stores, past the office buildings where legitimate businessmen made legitimate money. Joseph had been inside some of those buildings, meetings with bankers, with city councilmen, with men who took his money and pretended not to know where it came from. The legitimate world and the underworld, separated by a membrane so thin you could tear it with your fingernail. His office at the bakery was waiting. More ledgers to review, more decisions to make. A dispute between two of his bookmakers over territory. Someone would have to adjudicate, probably with Tony Jack standing in the corner as visual aid. A shipment of Canadian whiskey coming across the river tonight, despite Prohibition's repeal. Why pay taxes when you could pay a few cops instead? The endless machinery of organized crime, requiring constant lubrication, constant attention. But first, lunch. Angelo drove to a restaurant on Woodward, a place with white tablecloths and an owner who knew to have Joseph's usual table ready. They ate in the back room, pasta with clams, salad, bread still warm from the oven. Bill talked about his daughter's confirmation, about the new Cadillac he was considering. Angelo complained about his back, about getting old, about the young punks who didn't understand respect. Joseph mostly listened. He ate slowly, savoring the food, the brief respite from calculation. Through the doorway he could see the restaurant's main dining room businessmen, entertaining clients, couples on lunch dates, a family celebrating something. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the man in the back room controlled more of their city than the mayor did. After lunch, back to the bakery. The afternoon passed in meetings, phone calls, small decisions that accumulated into something larger. At 4 o'clock, Tony Jack arrived with a man Joseph didn't recognize, thin, nervous, wearing a suit that had been expensive once but was now threadbare at the cuffs. Mr. Zerilli, Tony Jack said, this is Robert Chen. He owns the laundry on Brush Street. Joseph gestured to the chair. Chen sat like he was made of glass, perched on the edge, hands folded in his lap. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. Mr. Chen, Joseph said, what can I do for you? I need to borrow money. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing. $5,000. My equipment is old. I need new washing machines, new presses. If I can't modernize, I'll lose my contracts with the hotels. You have collateral. The business, the building, I own it outright, and my house in Corktown. Joseph nodded to Bill, who pulled out a fresh ledger, began taking notes. How much do the hotels pay you monthly? About 1,800 total, but my costs are high, the old equipment breaks down. What are your monthly expenses? Chen recited numbers: rent, utilities, wages for his workers, maintenance, supplies. Bill wrote it all down, did the arithmetic. When Chen finished, Bill looked up at Joseph, shook his head slightly. The numbers didn't work. Mr. Chen, Joseph said gently, even with new equipment, you'll be operating at a loss. The hotels are squeezing you on price. You can't compete with the big commercial laundries. I know, but if I can just get through this year, build up some savings. You won't. The math doesn't work. Joseph leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers. Here's what I'll do. I'll buy your business. I'll pay you 8,000 for the building and equipment. That's more than it's worth, but I'm feeling generous. You can use that money to pay off whatever debts you have, maybe start fresh somewhere else. I'll keep you on as manager for 6 months, teach my people how to run a laundry. After that, you're on your own. Chen's face crumpled. This business was my father's. I can't just. Your father is dead. You're drowning. I'm offering you a life preserver. Joseph's voice remained gentle, almost kind. Take it. Chen looked at Tony Jack, who stood motionless behind him, then at Bill, who was already preparing the paperwork, then back to Joseph. What if I say no? Chen asked. Then you say no. You go back to your laundry, you try to make it work, and in 6 months, when you can't pay your suppliers and the hotels cancel their contracts, you come back here and beg. Except by then, I won't be feeling generous anymore. Chen signed the papers. After he left, Joseph stood at the window again, watching the street below. The afternoon was fading, shadows growing long. A group of children played stickball in an empty lot across the street, their shouts carrying through the glass. Normal children, like his own. Except these children would grow up in this neighborhood, would work in factories or warehouses, would maybe borrow money from someone like him when times got hard. That's 24, Bill said, filing the Chen paperwork. 24 what? Businesses we've acquired this year, not counting the Hoffer investment. Joseph did the math. 24 businesses, each one generating revenue, each one employing people who depended on him for their livelihoods. It was almost legitimate. Almost. We should diversify, he said. Too many of these are in the Eastern market. If the economy shifts, if the food business changes, we're exposed. What are you thinking? Manufacturing. Construction. The city's growing, they're building everywhere. We should own some of that. Bill made a note. I'll put out feelers. See what's available. The phone rang. Bill answered, listened, handed it to Joseph. It's Melly. Says there's a problem at the Policy Bank on Hastings. Joseph took the phone. What kind of problem? Angelo's voice was tight. The cops raided it an hour ago, arrested everyone inside, seized the cash box, about 12,000. Which cops? 6th Precinct. Captain Morrison's crew. Joseph was quiet for a moment, thinking. Morrison was on the payroll, had been for 3 years. 500 a month to look the other way. Either Morrison had gotten greedy, or someone higher up was making noise. Where's Morrison now? Joseph asked. At the precinct. Tony Jack's on his way there. Tell Tony to wait. I'll handle this myself. He hung up, reached for his coat. Bill, you're with me. We're going to have a conversation with Captain Morrison. The 6th Precinct station house was a brick fortress on Woodward, 3 stories of municipal authority and casual corruption. Joseph and Bill walked in through the front door like they owned the place, which, in a sense, they did. The desk sergeant looked up, recognized Joseph, reached for the phone. "Captain's expecting you," the sergeant said after a brief conversation. "Second floor, end of the hall." Captain Morrison's office smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. Morrison himself was a thick man in his 50s, with a drinker's nose and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much and cared too little. He stood when Joseph entered, gestured to the chairs facing his desk. "Mr. Zerilli, I was going to call you." "Were you?" Joseph sat, crossed his legs. Bill remained standing by the door. "Tell me about the raid on Hastings Street." Morrison sighed, sat heavily in his chair. "It wasn't my call. Order came from the Commissioner's office this morning. They're doing a sweep every policy bank in the city. Politics. The mayor's up for re-election. Needs to look tough on crime. And you couldn't warn us." "I found out at roll call, same time as everyone else. By then, it was too late." Joseph studied Morrison's face, looking for the lie. The captain met his eyes, didn't flinch, telling the truth, probably. Which meant the real problem was higher up the chain. "How much did you seize?" Joseph asked. 12,300. It's in the evidence room. I want it back." Morrison laughed, short and bitter. "Can't do it. Too many people involved, too much paperwork. This isn't a normal bust. The Commissioner's office is watching. I return that money, I'm done." "Then you're done," Bill said from the doorway. Morrison's face went pale. "You can't. I've been loyal. 3 years, never a problem." "Until today," Joseph said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to lose that evidence. A clerical error. Wrong form, wrong signature something. The money disappears from the evidence room, and no one can quite figure out where it went. You do that, we're square. You don't, and you'll spend the rest of your career directing traffic in the worst neighborhoods in this city. If you're lucky. And if I'm not lucky." Joseph smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You have a daughter at Wayne State, don't you? Studying to be a teacher. Pretty girl. Be a shame if something happened to her." Morrison's hands clenched on his desk. "You son of a bitch." "I'm a businessman, Captain. I pay for services rendered. You failed to render. Now you're going to fix it, or there will be consequences. Your choice." They left Morrison sitting at his desk, face red, breathing hard. Outside, the evening had turned cold, the first real bite of winter in the air. Bill lit a cigarette, offered one to Joseph. They smoked in silence, watching traffic pass. "Think he'll do it?" Bill asked. "He'll do it. He's got too much to lose. And if he doesn't..." Joseph flicked ash onto the sidewalk. "Then we make an example, but he will." They drove back to the bakery through streets that were coming alive with nightlife bars opening, restaurants filling, the city's after-dark economy beginning its shift. Joseph thought about Morrison, about the mayor's re-election campaign, about the delicate ecosystem of bribes and favors that kept the machine running. It was getting harder. The public was less tolerant of corruption than they'd been in the bootlegging days, when everyone was breaking the law and the cops were just another gang with badges. Now there were reformers, crusaders, newspaper editors who actually cared about good government. The world was changing. Joseph could feel it, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. The old ways, the crude violence of the Gianola Vitale War, the open bribery of the Prohibition era, wouldn't work forever. He needed to evolve, to build something more sustainable. The Teamsters partnership was part of that. The legitimate businesses were part of that, creating enough distance between himself and the violence that he could claim plausible deniability. At the bakery, Tony Jack was waiting in the office, along with a man Joseph recognized as Samuel Patterson, one of the numbers bankers who operated in Paradise Valley. Patterson was in his 40s, well-dressed, with the careful dignity of a black man who'd learned to navigate white Detroit without losing himself. "Mr. Zerilli," Patterson said, standing. "Thank you for seeing me." "Sit. What's the problem?" Patterson sat, hat balanced on his knee. "The raid this afternoon? That was my bank on Hastings. The cops took my cash box, arrested 6 of my writers. I need to make bail, and I need to get back up and running by tomorrow, or I'll lose my customers to the competition." "How much for bail?" $500 per person, 3,000 total. "And to get back up and running?" "Another 2,000 for the week's float, until I can collect what's owed from yesterday's plays." Joseph did the math. 5,000 plus the 12,000 Morrison had seized, 17,000 total. A significant hit, but not crippling. The policy banks generated that much in a good week. "I'll front you the 5,000, Joseph said. "Same terms as always. 25% weekly." Patterson's jaw tightened. "That's steep, Mr. Zerilli. I'm already paying you a cut of the action." "The cut is for permission to operate. This is a loan, different transaction." "I don't have much choice, do I?" "You always have a choice, Mr. Patterson. You can borrow from me, or you can try to raise the money elsewhere. But elsewhere takes time, and time is something you don't have. Your customers are placing bets right now with other bankers. Every hour you're closed, you're losing business you'll never get back." Patterson was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Then he nodded. "All right. 5,000. I'll have it back to you in 6 weeks. 8 weeks, Joseph said. "I'm not unreasonable, but after 8 weeks, if you haven't paid, we renegotiate. Understood?" "Understood." Bill prepared the paperwork, while Tony Jack counted out 5,000 in cash from the safe in the corner. Patterson signed, took the money, left without another word. After he was gone, Tony Jack closed the safe, spun the dial. "He won't make it," Tony Jack said. His voice was flat, certain. 8 weeks he'll be deeper in the hole. Then we take his operation. "Probably," Joseph agreed, "but maybe he surprises us. Either way, we win." The evening stretched on. More meetings, more phone calls. A dispute between 2 bookmakers over territory that Joseph settled by redrawing the boundaries and warning both men that the next dispute would be settled with Tony Jack's fists. A report from Angelo about the Teamsters' progress. 15 companies organized in 3 weeks, with 10 more ready to sign. A call from Josephine reminding him that Rosalie had a school concert tonight, and he'd promised to attend. He'd forgotten. The concert started in 40 minutes. "I have to go," he told Bill, reaching for his coat. "The Chen laundry paperwork." "Tomorrow. Family first." He drove fast, breaking the speed limit, making it to the school auditorium with 5 minutes to spare. Josephine was already seated, saving him a spot in the 3rd row. She gave him a look, relief mixed with reproach, but didn't say anything. Rosalie was on stage with the other children, holding a violin, looking nervous. The concert was excruciating. 11-year-olds murdering Mozart, the conductor gamely trying to keep them together. But Rosalie played beautifully, her small face serious with concentration, and when it was over, Joseph clapped until his palms hurt. Afterward, in the school hallway, Rosalie ran to him, violin case banging against her legs. "Papa, did you hear me? Did I do good?" "You were perfect," he said, and meant it. He lifted her up. She was getting too big for this, but she didn't complain and kissed her forehead. "Perfetta." Josephine took his arm as they walked to the car. "You smell like cigarettes and espresso." Long day. Every day is a long day. She didn't ask what he'd been doing. She never asked. That was the agreement they'd made 24 years ago, when he'd been a young man with nothing but ambition, and she'd been a girl who believed he'd give her a better life. He'd kept his promise. The house in Grosser Point, the good schools, the security. In exchange, she didn't ask questions. At home, he helped Rosalie with her homework, math problems that made his head hurt while Josephine made coffee. Anthony was out with friends, wouldn't be home until curfew. The house was quiet, peaceful. For a few hours, Joseph could pretend he was just a man, a father, a husband. Not the architect of a criminal empire that stretched across Detroit and beyond. But later, lying in bed while Josephine slept beside him, the pretense fell away. He stared at the ceiling, doing calculations in his head. 24 businesses acquired, 15 Teamster contracts, 47 active loans, each one accruing interest, each one a potential problem. The Morrison situation. The Patterson situation. The endless juggling act of keeping everyone paid, everyone loyal, everyone afraid. He thought about Martin Kowalski signing away his business with trembling hands. About Robert Chen losing his father's legacy. About Samuel Patterson borrowing money he probably couldn't repay. About Captain Morrison, caught between his badge and his bank account. All of them trapped in the web Joseph had built, struggling against threads they couldn't see. He felt no guilt. Guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford. These men had made choices, to borrow money they couldn't repay, to take bribes they couldn't refuse, to operate businesses in a city where Joseph Zerilli controlled the levers of commerce. They'd known the risks, or should have. The world was not kind to the weak or the foolish. But sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, he wondered what his father would think. Anthony Zerilli, who'd broken rocks in Terracini for pennies a day, who'd sent his only son to America with nothing but hope and prayers. Would he be proud of what Joseph had become? Or horrified? Joseph would never know. His father had died in 1928, never having left Sicily, never having seen the empire his son had built. Maybe that was for the best. He turned over, closed his eyes, tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new opportunities, new men desperate enough to make deals they'd regret. The web would grow. The machine would turn. And Joseph Zerilli would be there, at the center of it all, pulling strings and counting money and pretending, always pretending, that he was just a baker from Grosser Point. The Michigan winter of 1956 arrived without ceremony. Ice formed along the Detroit River in jagged sheets, and the wind off the water carried the smell of iron and cold stone. At 702 Middlesex Road in Grosser Point Park, The house stood like all the others on that block. Colonial revival, white columns, manicured lawn buried now under 2 feet of snow. Nothing distinguished it from the neighbors, except perhaps the black Cadillac Series 62 that idled at the curb most evenings, exhaust rising in white plumes against the street lamps. Inside, Joseph Zerilli sat in the study with the curtains drawn. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting shadows across the mahogany paneling. The radio played low, Tony Bennett singing something about a stranger in paradise. But Zerilli wasn't listening. He was reading the Detroit Free Press, folded twice so only the sports section showed. His reading glasses sat halfway down his nose. To anyone glancing through the window, and the FBI did glance often from the unmarked sedan parked 3 houses down, he looked like any other retired laborer passing the evening with a paper and a pipe. The phone rang. 2 short bursts, then silence. Zerilli didn't move. The phone rang again. 3 long rings this time, and he set down the paper, lifted the receiver. Yes. The voice on the other end was muffled, distant. They're coming in from New York tomorrow, 2 of them. They want to talk about the thing we discussed. Zerilli said nothing for a moment. He could hear his wife Josephine in the kitchen, the sound of dishes being stacked, water running. The house was warm. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. Tell them to come to the other place, he said finally. Not here. Understood. He hung up without saying goodbye. Across the street at 7021 Middlesex, a light went on in the second-floor window, a signal, though to whom only a handful of men in the city could say. The house at 7021 had been built with an interior corridor system, a hallway that ran the length of the second floor and connected to a rear staircase that opened onto the alley. Guests could enter through the front, conduct their business, and leave through the back without ever crossing paths. The architect had been paid well for his discretion. Zerilli stood, walked to the window, and peered through a gap in the curtain. The FBI sedan was still there. He could see the orange glow of a cigarette in the driver's seat. They'd been watching the house for 3 years now, ever since the Kefauver hearings made organized crime, a phrase that sold newspapers. Zerilli had testified, of course. He'd sat in that chair in Washington with the cameras rolling and the senators asking their questions, and he'd said the same thing over and over, I don't know nothing about that. His English was careful, slightly broken, the accent thick enough to sound authentic. He was just a baker, he'd told them. A man who invested in legitimate businesses. Beer distribution. Real estate. What did he know about gambling or unions or any of the other things they were suggesting? The senators hadn't believed him, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Now, in the warmth of his study, Zerilli let the curtain fall back into place. He returned to his chair, picked up his pipe, and tamped down the tobacco with his thumb. The bowl was cold. He didn't bother relighting it. Josephine appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. She was 51 years old, her hair still dark but beginning to grey at the temples. She wore a simple dress, pearls at her throat. She looked at him the way she always did. Patient, expectant, waiting for him to speak first. Are you hungry? She asked. No. You should eat something. Later, she nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. They'd been married 34 years. She knew better than to press. Zerilli reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small black ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates, numbers, all written in a code only he and Bill Tocco understood. He ran his finger down a column, stopped at a name, Ormento. John Ormento, out of New York, connected to the Lucchese family. Ormento was pushing heroin through Detroit, using the Pautanico pipeline that ran from Sicily through Montreal and down into the Midwest. The product was good pure, expensive, and the margins were extraordinary. But it brought heat. Federal heat. The kind that put men in prison for 20 years. Zerilli didn't like it. He'd made his fortune on bootlegging back when the law was a joke and half the cops in Detroit were on the take. He'd survived the wars, the sit-downs, the blood feuds that had killed better men than him. He'd done it by being patient, by thinking 3 moves ahead, by never putting his name on anything that could come back to haunt him. Heroin was different. Heroin made the papers. It made mothers cry and politicians campaign, and judges hand down sentences that couldn't be fixed with a bribe. Zerilli wanted no part of it, but he couldn't say that out loud. Not to the New York families, not to the men who sat on the commission. So instead, he played the game. He nodded when they talked. He took his cut. And he made sure that when the arrests came, it was someone else's name in the headlines. The doorbell rang. Zerilli glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was past 9. He wasn't expecting anyone. He heard Josephine's footsteps in the hallway, heard the door open, heard a man's voice, familiar, rough. Evening, Mrs. Zerilli, is Joe around? Angelo Melli stepped into the study without waiting for an invitation. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a grey overcoat and a black fedora, both dusted with snow. He took off the hat, shook it once, and set it on the desk. "Cold out there," Melli said. Zerilli gestured to the chair across from him. Melli sat, unbuttoned his coat, and pulled a pack of Lucky Strikes from his pocket. He offered one to Zerilli, who shook his head. "You talked to Bill?" Melli asked, lighting the cigarette. "Not today." Melli nodded, turned toward the door, then stopped. "You hear about the thing in New York?" "What thing?" "Genovese. He's calling a meeting. Big one. Upstate somewhere. He wants all the families there." Zerilli's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "When?" "Next month. Maybe the month after. Tony Jack heard it from a guy in Buffalo." "What's it about?" "Nobody knows. But Genovese don't call meetings unless he's got something to say." Zerilli set the pipe down on the desk. "Let me know when you hear more." "Will do." Melli left, and the house was quiet again. Zerilli sat in the lamplight, staring at the ledger on the desk. The numbers blurred together. He thought about Hoffa, about the Teamsters, about the millions of dollars sitting in the pension fund waiting to be skimmed. He thought about Genovese, about the meeting upstate, about what it meant when a man like Vito Genovese wanted all the families in one room. Nothing good. The phone rang again. Zerilli let it ring 4 times before he picked up. "Yes." "It's me." Bill Tocco's voice was low, cautious. "You alone?" "Yes." "Angelo came by?" "He just left." "You hear about Genovese?" "Angelo told me." "You think it's about the drug thing?" "Maybe. You gonna go?" Zerilli opened his eyes, stared at the ceiling. "If he asks, I'll go." "Be careful, Joe." "I'm always careful." He hung up, stood, and walked to the window again. The FBI sedan was still there. The cigarette in the driver's seat had burned down to nothing, and now a new one glowed in the dark. Zerilli wondered how long they'd sit out there. All night, probably. They had nothing better to do. Across the street, the light in the second-floor window of 72921 Middlesex went out. Zerilli turned away from the window, walked out of the study, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Josephine was already in bed, the lamp on her nightstand still burning. She looked up when he entered, set down the magazine she'd been reading. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Everything's fine." He undressed slowly, folded his clothes, and placed them on the chair by the window. When he climbed into bed, Josephine turned off the lamp, and the room went dark. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing as it slowed and deepened. He thought about the meeting Genovese was planning. He thought about the commission, about the seat he'd been offered, about what it meant to sit at that table with the bosses from New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. It meant power. It meant respect. It meant that Detroit, his Detroit, was no longer a backwater operation run by Sicilian immigrants who didn't know any better. But it also meant exposure. It meant the feds would be watching even closer. It meant every move he made would be scrutinized, analyzed, reported. Zerilli didn't like exposure. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Instead, he lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the windows, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the sky was the color of old steel. Zerilli woke before dawn, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs to the kitchen. He made coffee in the percolator, stood at the counter waiting for it to brew. The house was cold. He could see his breath in the air. When the coffee was ready, he poured a cup, carried it into the study, and sat at the desk. The ledger was still there, open to the same page. He stared at the names, the numbers, the careful notations he'd made over the years. All of it was code. All of it was deniable. But all of it was real. The phone rang. Zerilli picked it up. "Yes, they're here." It was the voice from the night before, muffled, careful. "They want to meet at noon." "Where?" "The bakery." Zerilli hung up, finished his coffee, and went upstairs to change. He put on a grey suit, a narrow tie, a black overcoat. When he came back downstairs, Josephine was in the kitchen making breakfast. She didn't ask where he was going. She never did. The Cadillac was waiting at the curb, engine running, exhaust rising in the cold air. The driver, a young man named Salvatore, one of Angelo Melli's nephews, opened the back door, and Zerilli climbed in. The interior smelled of leather and cigarettes. The driver pulled away from the curb, and the FBI sedan followed 3 car lengths behind. They drove east, through Grosse Pointe Park, and into Detroit proper. The streets were slick with ice, the sidewalks empty. They passed the old neighborhoods, Poletown, the East Side, the blocks where Zerilli had walked as a young man, where he'd learned the difference between men who talked and men who acted. The bakery was on Gratiot Avenue, a narrow storefront wedged between a butcher shop and the tailor. The sign above the door read, "Detroit Italian American Bakery," in faded gold letters. Zerilli had owned it since the 20s, back when it was a front for bootlegging operations. Now it was just a bakery. Mostly, the driver parked in the alley behind the building. Zerilli got out, walked to the back door, and knocked twice. The bolt slid back, and the door opened. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of yeast and flour. A man in a white apron nodded at Zerilli, said nothing, and led him through the kitchen to a back room. Two men were waiting. One was short, stocky, with a round face and small dark eyes. The other was taller, thinner, with a sharp nose and a scar above his left eyebrow. Zerilli recognized them both soldiers out of New York, connected to the Lucchese family. They stood when he entered, and the shorter one extended his hand. "Mr. Zerilli, good to see you." Zerilli shook his hand, then the other man's. He gestured to the table, and they all sat. "You want coffee?" Zerilli asked. "No, thank you." Zerilli folded his hands on the table, waited. The shorter man cleared his throat. "We wanted to talk to you about the situation with Ormento." "What situation?" "He's moving product through Detroit, a lot of it, and we're hearing that some of your people aren't happy about it." Zerilli's face didn't change. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "It matters if it's true." The taller man leaned forward. "Look, Mr. Zerilli, we're not here to cause problems. We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Ormento's got a good thing going with the Partenico pipeline. The product is clean, the margins are high, and everybody's making money. We don't want any misunderstandings." Zerilli was silent for a moment. He looked at the two men, studied their faces, their hands, the way they held themselves. They were nervous. They were trying not to show it, but he could see it in the way the shorter one kept glancing at the door, the way the taller one's fingers tapped against the table. "I don't have a problem with Ormento," Zerilli said finally. "What he does is his business. But if he's moving product through Detroit, he needs to talk to me first. That's the rule." "He thought he did talk to you." "He talked to someone, not me." The shorter man shifted in his seat. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying if Ormento wants to do business in Detroit, he comes to me. Not to Angelo, not to Tony Jack, to me. And we work out the details. Fair?" The two men exchanged a glance. The taller one nodded. "Fair," he said. Zerilli stood, and the meeting was over. The two men shook his hand again, and the man in the white apron led them out through the front of the bakery. Zerilli waited until he heard the door close, then walked back through the kitchen to the alley. The Cadillac was still there, engine idling. He climbed in, and the driver pulled away. They drove back to Grosser Point Park in silence. The FBI sedan was waiting when they arrived, parked in the same spot as before. Zerilli got out of the Cadillac, walked up the front steps, and went inside. Josephine was in the living room, knitting. She looked up when he entered, smiled. "How was your day?" she asked. "Fine," he said. He went into the study, closed the door, and sat at the desk. The ledger was still open. He picked up a pen, made a small notation next to Ormento's name, then closed the book and locked it in the drawer. Outside, the sun was setting, and the sky turned the color of bruised fruit. The street lamps came on one by one, casting long shadows across the snow. The FBI sedan was still there, and Zerilli knew it would be there all night, and the night after that, and the night after that. He didn't care. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and listened to the sound of the house settling around him. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past. The wind rattled the windows. And Joseph Zerilli sat in the dark, alone, thinking about all the things he would never say out loud. The rain came down in sheets that October night in 1957, drumming against the windows of the house on Middlesex Road. Inside, Joseph Zerilli sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched on the desk before him. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, throwing small constellations across the mahogany surface. He was 60 years old. The face that stared back from the darkened window glass was a stranger's, jowled, heavy-lidded, the skin beneath his eyes pouched and grey. When had that happened? He remembered being young in Terracini, remembered the salt smell of the Mediterranean, the way the fishing boats looked at dawn. Now Detroit pressed against him from all sides, this city of smoke and steel, and he could not remember the last time he had slept through the night. Across the street, in the house at 701 Middlesex, men were arriving. He heard the car doors closing, soft as whispers. They would use the corridor system, that clever architectural trick that let visitors enter and exit without crossing paths, without being seen from the street. Bill Tocco had suggested it years ago. Bill understood these things. Joseph lifted the scotch but did not drink. His hand, he noticed, had developed a tremor, not pronounced but there. The glass made a faint clicking sound against his wedding ring. The phone on his desk rang once, then stopped. The signal. They were ready for him. He stood slowly, feeling the weight in his knees, the dull ache that had taken up residence in his lower back. The house around him was silent. Josephine had gone to bed hours ago. Somewhere upstairs, one of the grandchildren was sleeping. He could never keep track of which ones were visiting when. They blurred together, these young faces, all of them expecting things from him he no longer knew how to give. Outside, the rain had turned the street into a river of black glass. Joseph pulled on his overcoat, cashmere, dark grey, expensive in a way that never showed. The air smelled of wet leaves and car exhaust. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking, the sound muffled and desperate. He crossed Middlesex with his head down, water soaking into his shoes. The leather would be ruined. Josephine would notice, would set them by the radiator without comment, would replace them within the week. This was how they communicated now, through the semaphore of domestic maintenance. The door at 7021 opened before he could knock. A young man he half recognized, one of Jack Tocco's people, stood aside without speaking. The interior hallway was warm, thick with cigar smoke and the smell of coffee. Joseph removed his hat, shook the water from it. The young man took it from him with both hands, as if it was something sacred. The corridor led him past rooms he had seen 100 times. Family photographs on the walls, crucifixes, a painting of the Bay of Naples that someone's grandmother had brought over on a steamship in 1906. These houses on Middlesex were museums of displacement, shrines to places that existed now only in memory and lies. The meeting room was in the back. As Joseph approached, he heard voices, low, careful, the particular music of men who knew their words were being recorded. The FBI had microphones everywhere now. In the walls, in the light fixtures, probably in the very furniture they sat on. It didn't matter. They had learned to speak in a language the recordings could never translate. He entered, and the conversation stopped. 6 men rose from their chairs. Jack Tocco, his nephew, with his college-educated vowels and his clean fingernails. Anthony Giacalone, Tony Jack, whose eyes were always moving, always calculating. Pete Licavoli, thick-necked and sullen. Dominic Corrado, who ran the books on the east side. Vito Giacalone, Tony's brother, quieter but no less dangerous. And Mike Polizzi, who had come up from the policy rackets and still dressed like a numbers runner, all flash and no substance. Joseph, Jack Tocco said. Just the name, nothing else. Joseph nodded and took his seat at the head of the table. Someone had already poured him coffee in a delicate china cup, the kind Josephine used when the priest came for dinner. The irony was not lost on him. We got word from New York, Tony Giacalone began, but Joseph raised one hand and Tony stopped mid-sentence. First, Joseph said, we talk about the weather. This was the ritual. They would spend 10 minutes discussing nothing. The tiger season, the new highway construction, someone's daughter's wedding. The microphones would record it all, and the FBI men listening in their unmarked van 3 blocks away would hear only banality. Only after this prologue would the real conversation begin, conducted in the elliptical poetry of implication and euphemism that had kept Joseph out of prison for 40 years. Tony Giacalone cleared his throat. Rained like this last week too. My wife, she's worried about the basement. Basements, Vito Giacalone agreed. Always something. They went around the table like this, each man contributing his small domestic complaint. Joseph watched them and said nothing. He had built this. He had built this. These men, this structure, this careful architecture of deniability. He had taken the chaos of the Gianola Vitale War. All that blood on the sidewalks, all those bodies in the street, and transformed it into something that looked, from the outside, like a legitimate business concern. The Detroit Partnership, even the name was a masterpiece of misdirection. My cousin in Toledo, Pete Licarboli said, he's having trouble with his construction contracts. And there it was, the shift. Joseph felt it in the room's temperature, in the way the men's postures changed, spine straightening, hands moving to coffee cups and cigarettes. What kind of trouble? Joseph asked. The kind where people don't understand how things work. The kind where they think they can operate without talking to the right people first. Joseph nodded slowly. Toledo was Licarboli's concern, had been for years. But Toledo connected to Detroit, and Detroit connected to Cleveland, and Cleveland connected to Chicago, and Chicago connected to New York. It was all one web, and Joseph sat at the center, feeling every vibration. Your cousin, Joseph said. He should talk to our friends in Cleveland. Mo Delitz, he understands construction. Licarboli nodded. The message was clear. The problem would be resolved through channels, through the invisible network of favors and obligations that stretched across the Midwest like a nervous system. There's also the matter of the pension fund, Jack Tocco said. Joseph looked at his nephew. Jack was smart, too smart maybe. He had that university gloss, that belief that intelligence could substitute for instinct. Joseph had seen men like Jack before. They thought the world was a problem that could be solved with logic. What about it? Our friend in the Teamsters. He's asking about additional funding for a project in Nevada. Nevada, Las Vegas. That desert mirage, where they were all pouring money like water into sand. Joseph had resisted it at first, too visible, too far from home, but the opportunities were undeniable. The frontier, the Aladdin. Money laundering itself while tourists pulled slot machine handles and thought they were having fun. How much? Joseph asked. Jack Tocco named a figure. Joseph showed nothing on his face, but inside he felt the old familiar calculation, the weighing of risk against reward. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund was a river of money, and they had been drinking from it for years. But rivers could flood. Rivers could drown you. Tell our friend we'll consider it, Joseph said, But we want to see the plans first. We want to know who else is involved. This meant we want to make sure we can control it, that it won't blow back on us, that the FBI won't trace the money to our doors. Jack nodded. He understood. The conversation moved on. They discussed union contracts at the Eastern Market, a dispute between two of their bookmakers on the West Side, the ongoing problem of younger men who didn't understand the old rules. Joseph listened more than he spoke. This too was part of his method. Let them talk, let them reveal themselves, let them think they were making decisions. At one point, Tony Giacalone mentioned a name, a federal prosecutor who was making noise about investigating labor racketeering. Joseph filed it away. Not a crisis yet, but something to watch. Something that might require a phone call to a judge, or a senator, or one of the lawyers they kept on retainer for exactly these situations. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the men filed out the same way they had come, through the corridor system, invisible to the watching world. Joseph remained seated, finishing his coffee. It had gone cold. Jack Tocco lingered. "Uncle," he said, "you look tired." "I am tired." "Maybe you should take some time. Go to Florida. Anthony's down there. He'd love to see you." Anthony, his son, the boy he had groomed to take over, who had instead gotten himself indicted in the Las Vegas skim case, who even now was fighting federal charges that could put him away for a decade. Joseph had come out of retirement to steady the organization after Anthony's arrest, had stepped back into the role he thought he'd left behind. "Anthony is a disappointment," Joseph said, and the words tasted like ash. Jack said nothing. What was there to say? They both knew it was true. "You," Joseph continued, "you have a good head. You think before you act. This is important." "I learned from you." "No, you learned from books. From that university. But you're learning from me now, and that's good." Joseph stood, feeling his knees protest. "The world is changing, Jack. The old ways, they don't work like they used to. The FBI, they have computers now. They have wiretaps that can hear a mouse breathe. We have to be smarter." "I understand." "Do you?" Joseph looked at his nephew, this young man with his clean hands and his careful speech. "Your father and I, we built this with blood. With our blood, with other people's blood. You think you can run it with just your brain, but there will come a time when you have to choose. When someone has to disappear, and you have to be the one who makes it happen. Can you do that?" Jack Tocco met his gaze. "If I have to." "You will have to." Joseph left him there and walked back through the corridor, past the photographs and crucifixes, past the painting of Naples. The young man returned his hat without a word. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street was still wet, reflecting the streetlights in long, yellow streaks. He crossed back to his own house, to the warmth and silence waiting there. In the kitchen, he poured himself another scotch, the bottle he kept hidden behind the flour canister, where Josephine pretended not to know about it. This one he drank, feeling it burn down his throat, feeling it settle in his stomach like a coal. Upstairs, he could hear someone moving, one of the grandchildren probably, getting up to use the bathroom. The house creaked and settled around him, full of other people's lives. Joseph sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. They were an old man's hands now, liver-spotted, the knuckles swollen. These hands had held a shotgun in 1920, had pulled the trigger that killed Tony Badalamenti. These hands had signed the order, never written, never spoken, but understood, that ended Chester Lamar's life. These hands had built an empire. And for what? He finished the scotch and climbed the stairs to bed. Josephine was asleep, her breathing soft and regular. Joseph undressed in the dark, hung his ruined shoes in the closet where she would find them in the morning. He slid between the sheets, careful not to wake her. Sleep would not come. It never did anymore. Instead, he lay there listening to the house breathe, listening to the distant sound of cars on Jefferson Avenue, listening to the blood move through his own veins. He thought about Teresini, about the boy he had been, the boy who had boarded a steamship in 1994 with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and his sister's address in Detroit. That boy had believed in America, had believed in the promise of transformation. What would that boy think of the man he had become? Joseph closed his eyes and saw faces. Tony Ginola, shot dead at a funeral. Sam Ginola, riddled with bullets on a bank sidewalk. Joe Mancello, bleeding out on a curb. John Vitale, torn apart by machine gun fire. Chester Lamar, murdered in his own kitchen. And how many others? How many men had died because of decisions made in rooms like the one he'd just left? He had told himself, for 40 years, that it was necessary, that this was how the world worked, that violence was the price of survival. He had built a system designed to minimize bloodshed, to replace the chaos of the old feuds with the order of business. And he had succeeded. The Detroit partnership was stable, profitable, powerful. But the bodies were still there, stacked up behind him like cordwood. Josephine stirred beside him, murmured something in her sleep. Joseph reached out and touched her shoulder, just briefly, just to feel the warmth of her. She had been 17 when they married, a child really. Now she was a grandmother, and he had given her everything except honesty. What did she know? What did she suspect? They had never spoken of it, not once in 35 years. The money arrived, the house stayed clean, the children were fed and clothed and sent to good schools. She went to Mass every Sunday and prayed for his soul, and he let her believe that prayer might be enough. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the bedroom ceiling. Joseph watched the light move, watched it fade. Somewhere in the city, his men were working, collecting debts, placing bets, moving money through the invisible channels he had created. The machine he had built ran without him now, ran on momentum and fear, and the accumulated weight of 40 years of precedent. He was, he realized, unnecessary. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it brought a strange relief. He had spent his entire adult life making himself indispensable, and now he understood that this had been a mistake. Indispensable men could never rest. Indispensable men died with their boots on, shot in the street, or arrested on the courthouse steps. Joseph wanted neither of those endings. He wanted to disappear. Not literally, he was too old for that, too tired. But he wanted to fade, to become a ghost in his own organization, to let Jack and Tony Giacalone and the others carry the weight while he sat in his study and drank scotch and remembered Teresini. But even as he thought it, he knew it was impossible. There were too many threads, too many connections that only he understood. The phone call to the judge in Cleveland. The arrangement with the Teamsters. The understanding with the New York families about territory and tribute. These things lived in his head, in the complex map of obligations and alliances that he had spent a lifetime drawing. If he disappeared, The map disappeared with him. Unless he taught Jack, unless he passed it on, piece by piece, name by name, favor by favor, it would take years. He might not have years. Joseph opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in one corner. He noticed it now for the first time, though it had probably been there for months. Water damage, most likely. Something that would need to be fixed. He made a mental note to tell Josephine in the morning, then realized he wouldn't. She would find it herself, would call someone to repair it, would handle it without bothering him. This was how their marriage worked. She managed the visible world, the house, the children, the social obligations. He managed the invisible one. And never the two shall meet. The scotch was wearing off, leaving behind a dull headache and a sour taste in his mouth. Joseph closed his eyes again and tried to summon sleep. Instead, he found himself back in 1920, back in the car with Bill Tocco and Angelo Melli, driving toward John Batali's house on that September night. He could still remember the weight of the Thompson gun in his hands, the way his palms had sweated despite the cold. He could remember the sound it made, not like in the movies, but sharper, more percussive, each shot a separate violence. He could remember Vitale's car lurching to a stop, the windshield spider webbing with cracks, the smell of cordite and blood. He had been 22 years old. Now he was 60, and the boy who had fired that gun was a stranger to him. Someone he had left behind in the same way he had left behind Terracini and the Mediterranean, and the belief that the world could be anything other than what it was. Beside him, Josephine's breathing changed. She was waking up. Joseph kept his eyes closed, feigning sleep. He felt her shift, felt her look at him in the darkness. Then she rose, careful not to disturb him, and padded to the bathroom. He heard water running, heard her moving through her nighttime ritual. When she returned to bed, she whispered, "Joseph?" He didn't answer. After a moment, she settled back into sleep. He lay there for another hour, maybe two, listening to the house. Listening to his wife breathe. Listening to the city outside, Detroit in all its industrial ugliness, this place that had made him rich and powerful and utterly alone. Finally, as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, Joseph Zerilli slept, and in his sleep he dreamed of the sea. The desert air smelled of ozone and creosote that October morning. Through the tinted windows of the Frontier Hotel's administrative offices, the mountains to the west held their purple shadows even as the sun climbed. Joseph Zerilli stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the early shift workers cross the parking lot below, dealers, pit bosses, cocktail waitresses in their abbreviated costumes, clutching sweaters against the pre-dawn chill, each one a number, each number a percentage. His suit, a charcoal wool from a tailor on Woodward Avenue, hung perfectly despite the flight from Detroit. The fabric breathed in ways these Western fabrics didn't. His shoes, black Oxfords with a mirror shine, made no sound on the carpet as he turned from the window. Anthony stood near the desk, leafing through a ledger. His son, 43 years old, and still holding papers, like they might bite him. The boy and Joseph still thought of him as the boy, despite the grey creeping into Anthony's temples, had been president of Hazel Park Raceway for 20 years. He understood horses. He understood odds. But this, the machinery of the countroom, the delicate calibration of greed and caution, this he grasped only in theory. The sportsbook is where they're bleeding us, Anthony said. He tapped a column of figures with his pen. Regulators are asking why our hold percentage is 3 points below the Sands. Joseph said nothing. He moved to the credenza, where someone had left a silver coffee service. The pot was still warm. He poured himself a cup, black, and watched the surface shimmer. Steam rose and disappeared. Behind him, Anthony continued, "We could adjust the lines, make it less obvious, or we could." "We do nothing." Joseph's voice was quiet. He didn't look at his son. "The sportsbook runs exactly as it runs." "But if the Gaming Commission..." "The Gaming Commission sees what we show them." He turned now, the cup balanced in both hands. "You worry about the wrong things, Anthony. You worry about the appearance of the thing. The appearance is already managed." Through the window, the sun had cleared the mountains. Light flooded the parking lot, turning the windshields into mirrors. A Lincoln Continental, midnight blue, the color of deep water, pulled up to the employee entrance. Joseph watched two men emerge. One he recognized, Michael Polizzi, who'd flown in from Detroit the day before. The other was local muscle, someone's nephew, forgettable. "Who handles the count tonight?" Joseph asked. "Dominic, same as always." "And the courier?" "Leaves at 3 a.m., drives to the airport, connects with the morning flight to St. Louis." Joseph sipped his coffee. It was bitter, over-extracted. They didn't know how to make coffee in this desert. Everything here was too new, too bright, too loud. Even the silence had a different quality. In Detroit, silence accumulated in corners, in the spaces between buildings that had stood for half a century. Here, silence was just the absence of slot machines. "Tony Giordano called last night," Anthony said. "He wants to know about the Aladdin." "What did you tell him?" "That you'd call him back." Joseph set down his cup. The porcelain made a small sound against the saucer. "Giordano wants what everyone wants. He wants to know the exact moment to move. He wants certainty." He walked to the window again, his reflection ghosting over the desert landscape. "There is no certainty. There is only the appearance of certainty, which we provide." The Aladdin sat 3 miles south on the strip, its turquoise dome visible from where they stood. James Tamer was already in place there, entertainment director, a title that meant nothing and everything. The current owners were drowning in debt. The Teamsters Pension Fund, that beautiful machine that Jimmy Hoffa had built and that Joseph had helped oil, was ready to extend a $50 million line of credit for the expansion. All that remained was the proper arrangement of names on paper. Frontmen, attorneys, shell corporations that led back to other shell corporations. "The Aladdin is a gift," Joseph said. "But you don't open a gift in front of the person who gave it to you. You wait, you take it home, you open it in private, and you never, ever show what's inside." Anthony closed the ledger. "Giordano thinks he should get 25%. Giordano thinks many things. He's got Kansas City backing him. Kansas City is backing Kansas City." Joseph turned from the window. "We are backing us. The difference is we've been doing this since before Tony Giordano knew which end of a gun to hold." The words came out harder than he'd intended. Anthony flinched, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. Joseph felt something twist in his chest. Not quite regret, but its cousin. The boy was trying. He'd always been trying. But trying wasn't enough in this life. You either knew or you didn't, and what you knew you'd learn by watching men die for their mistakes. Tell Giordano 20%, Joseph said, his voice softer now. Tell him it's a partnership. Equal partners. Tell him whatever he needs to hear to keep his hands off the machinery until we're ready to turn it on. Anthony nodded. He picked up the telephone, then hesitated. And if he pushes? He won't push. Tony Giordano is a practical man. He understands that 20% of something is better than 25% of nothing. Joseph moved toward the door. I'm going downstairs. I want to see the count room. It's not time for the count yet. Won't be until. I know what time it is. The hallway outside the office was carpeted in a pattern of gold and burgundy, colors chosen by some decorator who'd never seen a real palace. The walls were covered in flocked wallpaper, textured like velvet but cold to the touch. Overhead, recessed lights hummed with a frequency that made Joseph's teeth ache. Everything in Las Vegas hummed. The slot machines, the air conditioning, the electrical transformers hidden in the walls. The whole city was a machine pretending to be a dream. They took the elevator down. Anthony pressed the button for the casino floor, but Joseph reached past him and pressed the one below it. The basement, he said. The elevator descended with a hydraulic sigh. When the doors opened, the air was different, cooler, drier, touched with the smell of machine oil and cigarette smoke. A security guard sat at a metal desk, reading a magazine with a woman in a swimsuit on the cover. He looked up, saw Joseph, and stood so fast his chair scraped against the concrete. Mr. Zerilli, we weren't expecting. That's why I'm here. They walked down a corridor lit by fluorescent tubes that flickered and buzzed. The walls were cinder block, painted institutional green. No carpet down here. No flocked wallpaper. This was the real hotel, the skeleton beneath the skin. Pipes ran along the ceiling. Junction boxes sprouted from the walls like tumors. Somewhere in the distance, a compressor kicked on with a deep mechanical groan. The counter room door was steel, painted grey, with a small window of reinforced glass at eye level. Joseph stopped in front of it. Through the window, he could see the room beyond, a long table, chairs, empty now. In 6 hours, 3 men would sit at that table and sort currency by denomination. Bills from the casino cage, bills from the sports book, bills from the poker room. They would count and recount, filling out forms in triplicate, while a supervisor watched and a camera recorded everything from the ceiling. And before the supervisor arrived, before the camera was turned on, a portion of the take would be set aside. Not enough to be obvious. Not so little as to be insulting. Just enough. The skim. The real profit. Who installed the camera? Joseph asked. Anthony consulted a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. Allied Security Systems. Out of Los Angeles. Who owns Allied Security Systems? I'd have to check. Check. They stood in silence for a moment. Joseph pressed his palm against the steel door. It was cool, almost cold. Beyond it lay the machinery that turned cash into power. Power into influence. Influence into more cash. A perfect circle, or it would be if men didn't keep trying to complicate it. Your Uncle Bill used to say something, Joseph said, still touching the door. He said the only thing you can trust is what you can see, and the only thing you can see is what's in front of your face right now. Not yesterday. Not tomorrow. Right now. Uncle Bill also went to prison for tax evasion. Joseph smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yes, he did. Because he trusted his accountant to see what he couldn't see. Because he thought he could delegate his own vision. He turned to look at his son. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I think so. No, you don't think so. You either understand or you don't. He gestured at the door. This room, this table, these 3 men who will sit here tonight, they are the only truth in this entire building. Everything else is theater. The dealers, the pit bosses, the cocktail waitresses, the customers who think they can beat the house, all theater. But this room, this is where we take off the mask. Anthony's jaw worked. He was trying to find the right words, the words that would satisfy his father without revealing his own uncertainty. Joseph had seen this expression 1,000 times. On Anthony's face. On the faces of other men who worked for him. On his own face probably, 50 years ago, when he'd stood in front of the Gianola brothers, trying to prove he was worth the risk. I understand, Anthony said finally. Good. Joseph walked away from the door. Then understand this too. The Aladdin is 10 times bigger than the Frontier. 10 times more complicated. 10 times more ways for someone to make a mistake that brings federal agents to our door. So when we move on it, when we put our people in place, there can be no mistakes. Not one. They rode the elevator back up in silence. When the doors opened on the casino floor, the wall of sound hit them like a physical thing. Slot machines ringing and chiming. Dealers calling out cards. The low roar of conversation punctuated by laughter and the occasional whoop of a winner. Joseph stepped out into it and felt his shoulders tighten. All these people, all this noise, all this money changing hands, and none of them knew. None of them understood that the real game was being played in a basement room with a steel door and a camera that could be turned off. A woman in a silver cocktail dress walked past carrying a tray of drinks. She smiled at Joseph, a professional smile that never touched her eyes. He didn't smile back. He was already thinking about the phone call he'd have to make to Tony Giordano, the exact words he'd use to make 20% sound like a gift instead of a compromise. Anthony touched his elbow. There's a sit-down tonight. 8 o'clock, at the house on Rancho Drive. Who's coming? Polizzi, the Kansas City people, a lawyer from the Teamsters. Cancel the lawyer. But he's flying in specifically for. Cancel him. We don't need lawyers at this stage. Lawyers are for after we've already decided what we're doing. Right now, we're still deciding. They walked through the casino, past the craps tables where men in short sleeves threw dice and shouted at numbers, past the blackjack tables where dealers flipped cards with mechanical precision, past the roulette wheel spinning its hypnotic orbit. Joseph felt eyes on him. Not many, but some. People who knew or suspected who he was. He kept his face neutral, his pace steady. Never hurry. Never hesitate. Move through the world as if you own it, because in the ways that matter, you do. Outside, the heat was already building. By noon, it would be over 100 degrees. The valets were parking a Cadillac Eldorado, cream-colored with a white vinyl top. An older couple emerged. The man in a plaid sport coat, the woman in a dress with a pattern of palm fronds. Tourists. They looked around with the expression of people who'd just landed on the moon. Joseph's car was waiting at the curb, a black Lincoln Continental, the same model as the one he'd seen that morning, but darker, more serious. The driver, a young man named Paulie who'd come out from Detroit 6 months ago, held the rear door open. "Where to, Mr. Zerilli?" "The house." They drove north on the strip, past the Sahara and the Silver Slipper, past the Stardust, where the marquee advertised Lido de Paris, and the sign promised, the greatest show in Las Vegas. Joseph watched it all slide past the tinted windows. In 10 years, maybe 15, this whole strip would be transformed. More hotels, bigger casinos, corporate ownership creeping in like a slow tide. The days when a man like him could walk into a counter room and touch the steel door, could feel the weight of the operation in his hands, those days were numbered. But not yet, not today. The house on Rancho Drive was a low-slung ranch style with a tile roof and a circular driveway. Palm trees stood like sentries in the front yard. Inside, the air conditioning was running full blast, making the air taste metallic. Joseph walked through the living room furniture in earth tones, abstract paintings on the walls, a wet bar in the corner, and out to the patio. The pool was kidney-shaped, its surface perfectly still. Beyond the property line, the desert stretched away toward mountains that looked purple in the afternoon light. Joseph sat down in a wrought-iron chair and lit a cigarette, his first of the day. The smoke tasted harsh in the dry air. He thought about Tony Giordano. A practical man, yes, but also a man with ambitions. St. Louis was a good territory, but it wasn't Detroit. It wasn't the automotive unions, the Teamsters, the produce markets, the waste hauling. Giordano wanted a piece of Las Vegas because Las Vegas was the future, or at least that's what everyone kept saying. The future. As if the future was a place you could drive to, instead of something that arrived, whether you were ready or not. Joseph had been ready for 40 years. Since the morning in 1920, when he'd stood outside Tony Badalamenti's grocery store with a gun in his pocket and murder in his heart. Since the night they'd killed John Vitale and ended the war that had already killed too many. He'd learned then that the future belonged to whoever could see it coming and position themselves in its path. Not to the strongest, not to the bravest, to the ones who understood that power was a river, and you either learned to swim in it or you drowned. The sliding glass door opened behind him. Anthony stepped out carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to Joseph and sat down in the adjacent chair. "Polizzi called," Anthony said. "He's running late. Traffic on the freeway." "There's always traffic," he said to start, without him, if necessary. Joseph sipped the tea. It was too sweet, the way Americans made it. "We'll wait." They sat in silence. A bird, Joseph didn't know what kind, landed on the edge of the pool and dipped its beak into the water. It drank, tilted its head, drank again. Then it flew away, a dark shape against the bright sky. "Can I ask you something?" Anthony said. Joseph didn't answer, which was as close to permission as he ever gave. "Do you ever think about going back to Sicily?" "No, not even to visit, to see where you grew up." Joseph ground out his cigarette in the ashtray on the table between them. "The place I grew up doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never did. What I remember is a child's memory. And children don't see things as they are. They see things as they wish them to be. Still, it might be nice too. Nice is not a word I use." He looked at his son. Nice is for people who have the luxury of nostalgia. We don't have that luxury. We have work to do. Anthony nodded, but Joseph could see the disappointment in his eyes. The boy wanted something from him, some acknowledgement of shared humanity, some moment of vulnerability. But Joseph had learned long ago that vulnerability was a currency you spent only once, and after that you were bankrupt. The sun moved across the sky. The shadow of the house crept across the patio. Joseph closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the pool filter humming, the distant whoosh of traffic on Rancho Drive, the air conditioning compressor cycling on and off. All machines, all systems, all perfectly calibrated to create the illusion of comfort while extracting maximum value from those who sought it. When he opened his eyes, the light had changed. The mountains were no longer purple but gold, touched by the descending sun. Michael Polizzi's car, a Cadillac sedan, DeVille, bronze with a black vinyl top, pulled into the driveway. Joseph watched through the window as Polizzi emerged, adjusting his tie, checking his reflection in the car window. Vanity. Another luxury Joseph had never permitted himself. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They sat around the dining room table, Joseph at the head, Anthony to his right, Polizzi to his left, the Kansas City representatives across from him. Two men he'd met before, but whose names he'd already forgotten. They were functionaries, messengers, men who would report back to their bosses and translate Joseph's words into something those bosses could understand. They discussed the Aladdin. They discussed the Teamsters loan. They discussed the frontmen who would hold the paper, Johnny Formosa out of Philadelphia, a few others whose names meant nothing but whose willingness to sign documents meant everything. They discussed the expansion plans, the new tower, the additional gaming space. They discussed the projected revenue and the projected skim and the careful mathematics that would keep the Gaming Commission satisfied while ensuring that everyone got their proper share. Joseph spoke less than anyone else at the table. He listened. He watched. He noted who interrupted whom, who deferred to whom, who checked their watch when they thought no one was looking. These small gestures told him more than all the words being spoken. They told him who was confident and who was nervous, who understood the plan and who was simply following orders. When it was over, when the Kansas City men had left and Polizzi had driven away, Joseph stood on the patio again and smoked another cigarette. Anthony was inside, cleaning up the glasses and ashtrays, playing the role of host. The role of son. The desert night had come on fast, the way it always did. One moment the sky was gold, the next it was purple, and then it was black with stars scattered across it like casino chips on felt. Joseph looked up at those stars and thought about probability, about odds, about the mathematics of chance that governed everything from the spin of a roulette wheel to the arc of a human life. He'd beaten the odds. He'd survived when others hadn't. He'd built something that would outlast him, or at least that was the plan. But standing here under these stars, in this desert that was not his desert, in this city that was not his city, he felt the weight of all those years pressing down on him. 72 years old. How many more did he have? 5, 10, and what would happen to all of this when he was gone? Anthony came out onto the patio. Everything's cleaned up. You want me to drive you back to the hotel? No, I'll stay here tonight. You sure? The bed in the guest room isn't. I'm sure. Anthony hesitated, then nodded. I'll see you tomorrow then. We've got the contractor coming at 10 to look at the Hazel Park expansion. Fine. And then lunch with Anthony. Joseph turned to face his son. Go home, kiss your wife, play with your children, be a person for a few hours instead of a businessman. You'll live longer. Anthony smiled, uncertain whether his father was joking. Okay, good night, Dad. Good night. After Anthony left, Joseph went inside and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the bar. Johnny Walker, Black Label, the bottle 3/4 full. He carried the glass to the living room and sat down in one of the earth-toned chairs. The house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the structure settling in the cooling night. He thought about Bill Tocco, his cousin, his brother-in-law, his partner for more than 50 years. Bill was gone now, dead for over a decade, and Joseph still found himself wanting to pick up the phone and call him. To talk through a problem. To share a joke. To simply hear the voice of the one person in the world who'd known him before he became Joseph Zerilli, boss of Detroit, untouchable, unreachable. Bill had understood something that Joseph was only now beginning to grasp, that power was a kind of loneliness. The more you accumulated, the more isolated you became, until eventually you were sitting in a house that wasn't really yours, in a city that wasn't really yours, drinking scotch that tasted like ashes and wondering if any of it had been worth it. But that was self-pity, and Joseph had no patience for self-pity. He finished the scotch, rinsed the glass in the kitchen sink, and went to the guest bedroom. The bed was narrow, the mattress too soft. He lay on top of the covers, still fully dressed except for his shoes, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the city hummed. Slot machines rang. Dealers shuffled cards. Cocktail waitresses carried drinks. And in a basement room with a steel door and a camera that could be turned off, 3 men would soon sit down at a table and begin the count. They would sort the bills by denomination. They would fill out forms in triplicate. And before the supervisor arrived, before the camera was turned on, they would set aside a portion of the take. Not enough to be obvious, not so little as to be insulting. Just enough. Joseph closed his eyes. The hum of the air conditioning became the hum of the city, became the hum of the machine he'd helped build. And somewhere in that hum, in that endless mechanical rhythm, he found something that approximated peace. Tomorrow, there would be more meetings, more phone calls, more careful negotiations, and calculated risks. Tomorrow, he would put on his suit and his shoes and his mask, and he would be Joseph Zerilli again, boss of Detroit, untouchable, unreachable. But tonight, in this house that wasn't his, in this bed that wasn't his, he was just Joseph. A boy from Terracini who'd crossed an ocean and built an empire, and now lay awake, wondering if the empire would outlast him, or if it would crumble the moment he closed his eyes for the last time. The air conditioning cycled off. In the sudden silence he could hear his own breathing, slow and steady. The breathing of a man who'd learned to control everything, even his own body's rhythms. And then, finally, he slept. The rain came down in sheets that July evening, drumming against the roof of 702 Middlesex Road, with a persistence that matched the old man's thoughts. Joseph Zerilli sat in the dim study, the lamp on his desk casting shadows that climbed the mahogany paneling like vines. Outside, Grosse Pointe Park slept its affluent sleep sprinklers on timers, German sedans in driveways, the kind of quiet money buys when it wants distance from what made it. He could hear Josephine moving somewhere in the house. The soft pad of her slippers on carpet. 70 years old, and she still moved through rooms like she was straightening things, though the house had been spotless for decades. A maid came 3 times a week. But Josephine needed the motion, the small rituals that filled the hours between meals and mass, and the telephone calls from grandchildren who asked careful questions about his health. The study smelled of leather and tobacco, though he'd given up cigars 2 years ago when the coughing started. His doctor, a man whose father he'd known, whose medical school tuition had come from a loan that was never quite repaid, had used words like emphysema and cardiovascular strain. Joseph had nodded, agreed to quit, then spend the drive home thinking about how doctors always spoke, as if the body were a machine that could be fixed by following instructions. On the desk before him sat a crystal tumbler, empty except for the amber residue of scotch that had long since been consumed. Beside it, a leather appointment book, closed. The phone, silent. Through the window, he could see the house across Middlesex, 701, where the interior corridor system allowed men to come and go without neighbors noticing the traffic. Tonight, the windows were dark. The meeting had been 3 days ago, July 30th, Wednesday. Joseph lifted the tumbler, swirled the last drops, set it down without drinking. The motion was automatic, something to do with his hands while his mind worked through the permutations. In the old days, Terracini, the bakery on East Congress, even the blood-soaked winter of 1920 problems had been simpler. A man wronged you, you settled it. Territory was marked with bullets and handshakes, and everyone understood the currency of respect. But this thing with Hoffa, this was different. The rain intensified, a gust of wind throwing water against the window, hard enough to make the glass shudder. Joseph watched the rivulets race down the pane, merging and splitting in patterns that seemed random, but followed laws he couldn't name. Somewhere in the house a door closed. Josephine probably, checking the locks before bed. She never asked about his business. 53 years of marriage, and she'd perfected the art of not seeing what was in front of her. He'd been 24 when they married. She'd been 17, fresh-faced, the daughter of a Hamtramck grocer who'd been honored that Joseph Zerilli wanted his girl. The wedding had been modest. This was 1922. The bakery was just starting to turn profit, and Joseph had learned early that flash attracted attention. Better to look like every other Sicilian immigrant scraping by, even when the back room held cash from bootlegging runs across the river. Josephine had given him 6 children. Raised them Catholic, kept them clean, made sure they did their schoolwork. She'd asked for nothing except that he come home at night, and he had, mostly. The other women, and there had been a few, discreet arrangements that lasted months or years before fading into the past, she'd never mentioned. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps she'd made the same calculation every mob wife made, comfort and security in exchange for willful blindness. He pushed the tumbler away, stood slowly. His knees protested, the joints grinding like old machinery. 77 years. The number felt abstract, something that applied to other men. In his mind he was still 30, still the young soldier who'd walked into that Wayne County jail corridor with a Colt 38, and put 23 bullets into Vito Renda, while the man screamed Sam Gianola's name to the guards. But mirrors didn't lie, and neither did the way his hands shook some mornings before the first coffee. He moved to the window, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the rain. The street was empty. A sedan rolled past, headlights cutting through the downpour, some neighbor returning from dinner in the city. Joseph tracked it until it turned onto a side street, then let his eyes unfocus, seeing not Grosse Pointe but the alley behind the American State Bank, October 1999. Sam Janola's body sprawled on the pavement with 28 entry wounds. That had been the beginning. Not his first killing. He'd been blooded in the Gianola Vitale War, had stood in rooms where men were beaten until they gave up names. But Sam's death had marked the moment when Joseph understood that survival meant being the last man standing. Not the strongest. Not the loudest. The last. John Vitale had learned that lesson too late. September 28, 1920, trapped in his car at Marantet, and 14th 18 bullets from a Thompson submachine gun, turning his body into something that barely resembled human. Joseph hadn't been there for that one plausible deniability even then, but he'd heard the details. How Vitale's hands had been frozen on the steering wheel. How his mouth had been open, as if he'd been trying to speak when the first burst hit him. The phone on the desk rang, sharp, insistent. Joseph turned, stared at it. 2 rings, 3. He didn't move. On the 4th ring, it stopped. Josephine appeared in the doorway, her robe cinched tight, her grey hair in curlers. "Was that for you?" "No." "It's late. I know." She studied him with eyes that had seen him through wars and depressions, and the slow accumulation of wealth that had moved them from East Congress to Indian Village to finally here. The suburbs where the old Detroit money lived. "You should sleep," she said. "Soon." She hesitated, then nodded and withdrew. Her slippers whispered down the hallway. A door closed. Joseph returned to the desk, sat, opened the appointment book. The pages were mostly empty. A doctor's visit on the 5th. Lunch with Jack Tocco on the 22nd. Nothing for July 30th, though that had been the most important day of the month. He'd learned long ago not to write things down. The meeting had been at the house on Middlesex, but not this one. The other house. The one with the corridors. Joseph had sat in the back room, no windows, soundproofed walls, a table that could seat 8, and listened while Tony Giacalone laid out the situation. Hoffer wanted back in. After everything, the convictions, the prison time, the agreement he'd signed to step away from the Teamsters as condition of his pardon, Jimmy wanted back in. He'd been making calls, setting up meetings, talking to the old locals like he could just walk back into the presidency and everything would be the way it was in 1964. "You don't understand," Tony had said, his thick hands spread on the table. "The fun's running smooth. We got our people in place. He comes back. He brings heat. Federal heat. The kind we don't need." Joseph had said nothing. Around the table, the others, Pete Licavoli, Mike Polizzi, Jack Tocco, had waited. This was how it worked now. He didn't give orders anymore, not directly. He listened. He let them talk themselves into the conclusion he'd already reached. "Provenzane's got the same problem in Jersey," Tony had continued. "Hoffer's talking about cleaning house, going after the guys who took over while he was inside. Tony Pro wants him gone." "Gone," Joseph had repeated. The word hung in the air. "Disappeared," Tony had said. "Clean, no body, no case, just gone." Joseph had looked at each man in turn. Pete Licavoli, who'd helped him kill Chester Lamar 44 years ago. Mike Polizzi, who'd been with him in the Vegas expansion, who'd helped skim millions from the Frontier and the Aladdin. Jack Tocco, his nephew, the man he was grooming to take over when Joseph finally stepped aside. None of them had met his eyes. "This is council business," Joseph had said finally. "We vote." They'd voted. Unanimous. Afterward, alone in his car, a black 1975 Cadillac sedan DeVille, with leather seats and a V8 engine that purred like a sleeping cat. Joseph had sat in the driveway and watched rain begin to fall. He'd thought about the first time he'd met Hoffa, back in the 40s, when Jimmy was just a tough kid from the Strawberry Boys, breaking heads for the Teamsters in the produce district. Joseph had seen something in him then, ambition, yes, but also a willingness to make deals, to understand that the world ran on arrangements between men who knew how to keep their mouths shut. They built something together. The Teamsters Pension Fund had financed half the casinos in Vegas, had bankrolled shopping centers and hotels and office buildings from Miami to Los Angeles. Hoffa had gotten rich. The families had gotten richer. Everyone had understood the arrangement. But Jimmy had never learned when to quit. He'd pushed too hard, talked too loud, made himself into a symbol that the government couldn't ignore. And when they'd finally gotten him, jury tampering, fraud, conspiracy, he'd done his time and come out thinking the world owed him his throne back. The world didn't owe anyone anything. Joseph had learned that in 1999, watching Sam Ginola bleed out on a bank floor. He closed the appointment book, stood again. His back ached. The scotch had worn off, leaving behind a dull throb behind his eyes. He moved through the dark house, past the living room with its uncomfortable antique furniture, past the dining room where Josephine insisted on setting the table with china, even when it was just the two of them, past the kitchen where the refrigerator hummed its electric song. In the hallway he paused at a photograph on the wall. His children, taken in 1955. Anthony in the center, the oldest, wearing a suit that was too expensive for a 25-year-old. The girls flanking him, pretty and proper in their dresses. And in the back, standing slightly apart, Joseph himself, looking at the camera with an expression that gave nothing away. Anthony had been such a disappointment. Joseph had given him everything. Education. Anthony had graduated from the University of Detroit, one of the first in the family to finish college. Position. He'd made Anthony president of Hazel Park Raceway in 1949, handed him a money machine that required nothing except showing up and not stealing too obviously. Opportunity. When the Vegas expansion started, Joseph had brought Anthony in on the Frontier deal. Let him sit at tables with men from Kansas City and St. Louis and learn how the real money was made. And Anthony had gotten caught, convicted in the Skim case in 1974, sentenced to federal prison like some street corner bookmaker who couldn't keep his record straight. Joseph had been forced to come out of retirement to clean up the mess, to sit in rooms with men 30 years younger and pretend he still had the energy to run an empire that stretched from Detroit to Las Vegas to Miami. To watch while his son's failure proved what Joseph had always suspected, that bloodlines meant nothing, that strength didn't pass from father to son like blue eyes or a crooked nose. He'd started grooming Jack Tocco instead. His nephew, Bill's boy. Jack was smart, educated, careful. He understood that the new world required lawyers and accountants, not gunmen. He knew how to sit in a room and say nothing, while others incriminated themselves. But Joseph was tired, so tired. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister. The house was too big for two people. Too many rooms, too much space that needed to be heated in winter and cooled in summer. But Josephine loved it here, loved the address, loved telling her friends at church that she lived in Grosse Pointe Park. So they stayed. In the bedroom she was already asleep, a small shape under the covers, breathing softly. Joseph undressed in the dark, hung his suit in the closet, pulled on pajamas that smelled of detergent and fabric softener. He slid into bed carefully, trying not to wake her. But she stirred, rolled toward him. "You're cold," she murmured. "It's raining." "I heard the phone." "Wrong number." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Joseph." "Yes." "Are you all right?" He stared at the ceiling, at shadows cast by streetlight filtering through curtains. "I'm fine." "You seem, I don't know, distant." "I'm tired." "You're always tired." He didn't respond. After a while, her breathing deepened, slowed, and he knew she'd fallen back asleep. But Joseph lay awake, listening to the rain, thinking about Jimmy Hoffa. The plan was simple. Tony Giacalone would set up a meeting at the Macus Red Fox, a restaurant in Bloomfield Township. Neutral ground. Hoffa would think he was sitting down with Tony Jack and Tony Provenzano to negotiate his return to power. He'd show up alone, or maybe with one guy, someone who wouldn't matter. And then he'd disappear. The details Joseph didn't want to know. That was the point of having layers, of building an organization where orders passed through multiple hands before reaching the men who actually pulled triggers or dug holes. If the FBI came asking questions, and they would, Joseph could sit in his lawyer's office and honestly say he didn't know where Jimmy Hoffa was. Because he wouldn't, not specifically, not in a way that could be proven. The rain was stopping. The drumming on the roof faded to sporadic taps, then silence. Through the window, Joseph could see clouds breaking apart, moonlight spilling through the gaps. The street below glistened, wet and empty. He thought about Terracini, the village on the Sicilian coast where he'd been born 77 years ago. He hadn't been back since 1994, since the day he'd boarded the SS Taormina and sailed to New York with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and his sister Josephine's address in Detroit. Sometimes he tried to remember what it had looked like. The narrow streets, the smell of the sea, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. But the memories were faded, like photographs left too long in sunlight. What he remembered instead were feelings. Hunger, always hunger, and the understanding that he would never be anything in Terracini except another peasant boy waiting for his father to die so he could inherit a patch of rocky soil that barely grew enough to feed a family. America had been different. In America, if you were smart and ruthless and willing to do what others wouldn't, you could build something. You could take a bakery and turn it into an empire. You could stand in rooms with men who'd been born rich and make them understand that you were their equal, that your money spent the same as theirs even if it smelled of blood and bootlegged whiskey. But America took things too. It took the language from your mouth, replaced your name with an Americanized version that fit more easily on legal documents. It took your children, raised them soft, gave them educations that made them think they were better than the men who built the foundation they stood on. It took your youth, your health, your certainty that the world made sense. And now it was taking Jimmy Hoffa. Joseph rolled onto his side, pulled the covers up to his chin. His body ached in a dozen places, knees, back, shoulders, the old bullet wound in his left arm from a fight in 1925 that he barely remembered. He was falling apart piece by piece, and no amount of money could stop it. The phone rang again, downstairs, distant. Joseph didn't move. He listened to it ring 4 times, 5, 6, until it stopped. Beside him, Josephine slept on. He closed his eyes and waited for morning. The rain came down in sheets that October night, turning Middlesex Road into a river of black glass. Inside the house of 702, The old man lay in a hospital bed. They'd wheeled into the downstairs study, mahogany paneling, leather chairs. The smell of furniture polish and something else now, something medicinal that clung to the drapes. The Bonsecours nurses had done what they could. 2 days ago they'd sent him home. Nothing more to do, they'd said, which was their way of saying the thing nobody wanted to say out loud. Joseph Zerilli, Joseph as the Americans called him, stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain hammer the windows. 79 years old. Funny how the body gave out, but the mind kept grinding, kept tallying, kept running the numbers. He could still do it, even now. The percentages. The angles. Who owed what to whom? In the corner, his wife Josephine sat in the wing-back chair, her rosary beads clicking softly. She'd been there for hours, maybe days. Time had gone slippery. She didn't look at him much anymore. Just the beads, her lips moving without sound. Married 55 years, and they'd run out of words somewhere around 1950. The house creaked. Footsteps upstairs. His son Anthony, probably. Or maybe Jack Tocco, his nephew, the one with the college degree and the steady hands. Jack had been coming around more lately, sitting in the room, not saying much. Just watching. Learning. Anthony never learned anything, got himself indicted in that Las Vegas mess. Had to serve 4 years federal time, came out thinking he was still the boss. The kid didn't understand that you don't get to be boss by wanting it. You get to be boss by being the last one standing when everybody else bleeds out on the pavement. Joseph shifted slightly, and pain shot through his chest like voltage. The cancer, they'd said, though nobody used that word around him. As if he didn't know. As if 79 years on this earth hadn't taught him to recognize the smell of rot. Outside, a car door slammed. He heard voices in the front hall, low, respectful. More visitors. They'd been coming in shifts all week. Paying respects. That's what they called it. What they meant was making sure he was really dying, calculating what his death would mean for their piece of the pie. The door opened and Jack Tocco stepped in, rain beaded on the shoulders of his charcoal suit. Behind him, Tony Giacalone, the street boss, holding his fedora in both hands like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Giacalone had run the day-to-day for the last 3 years, ever since Joseph's legs had given out and the stairs became impossible. Giacalone was good at what he did. Enforcement, collections, keeping the union locals in line. But he wasn't a thinker. He was a hammer, and hammers don't build empires. Uncle Joe, Jack said quietly, moving to the bedside. His voice had that college smoothness, no trace of the Terracini growl that still roughened Joseph's English after 63 years. How are you feeling? Joseph's throat was dry. He worked his tongue, managed a sound that wasn't quite a word. Josephine looked up from her beads, then away again. Jack pulled up a chair. Giacalone stayed by the door, shifting his weight. Raining like hell out there, Jack continued. Streets are flooding down by the river. The river. Joseph closed his eyes and saw it. Not the Detroit River with its freighters and border patrols, but the Mediterranean of Terracini, that impossible blue, the fishing boats with their patched sails. He'd left that coast in 1994, a 17-year-old kid with nothing but the clothes on his back and an address on East Congress Street where his sister lived. The SS Taormina, 14 days of vomit and sardine bunks, and the stink of 200 Sicilians packed below deck. He'd stood on the rail as they pulled into New York Harbor and thought, America. The word had tasted like a promise, Turned out America was a milkman's route in Detroit winter, your hands cracking and bleeding from the cold. America was a laborer's job digging ditches for Michigan Consolidated Gas, 10 hours a day, your back screaming. America was learning that the only difference between the old country and the new was that here the cops spoke English when they put their hands out for the envelope. Uncle Joe? Jack's voice pulled him back. Joseph opened his eyes. The ceiling again. Water-stained plaster, a crack running from the light fixture to the corner. He'd been meaning to have that fixed. We got word from St. Louis, Jack said, leaning closer. Giordano's people want to know about the Aladdin situation. The expansion's running over budget. They're asking if we want to put in more or pull back. The Aladdin. Las Vegas. That whole desert mirage that was supposed to be Anthony's big score. His chance to prove he could run things. Instead, the kid had gotten sloppy, left his fingerprints all over the Frontier skim operation, and now he was damaged goods. The Nevada Gaming Commission had his photograph in a file somewhere, probably pinned to a corkboard with a red circle around his face. Joseph tried to speak. His lips moved, but nothing came out except a wheeze. "Don't strain yourself," Jack said. "We can handle it. I just wanted you to know we're keeping things steady." That was the word Joseph had drilled into them all. No headlines. No cowboy bullshit like Capone pulling in Chicago, getting his face on the cover of Time magazine. You want to last, you stay in the shadows. You let the politicians take the bows. You let the union presidents make the speeches. You sit in your house in Grosser Point, and you count the money, and you never, ever let them see you sweat. He'd learned that lesson in 1999, watching Sam Ginola bleed out on a bank floor, 28 bullets in him, because Sam had been too proud to run when he had the chance. Joseph had been 22 years old, standing in the crowd outside the American State Bank, watching the cops carry Sam's body out on a stretcher, and he'd thought, that's not going to be me. I'm not dying on a sidewalk for a percentage of a bakery. So he'd played it smart. Partnered with his cousin Bill Tocco, the only man he'd ever truly trusted, and they built something that lasted. No drama. No feuds. Just business. When Prohibition came, they'd been ready. When the unions needed muscle, they provided it. When the Teamsters needed a pension fund to raid, they'd held the door open. 50 years of careful, patient work, and what did it get him? A hospital bed in his own study, Josephine's rosary beads, the rain. Jack alone cleared his throat. "Boss, you want me to come back later? We can." Joseph's hand moved, just slightly, enough. Jack stood. "We'll let you rest. Josephine, you need anything?" She shook her head, didn't look up. The two men left. The door clicked shut. The house settled back into its rhythms, rain on the roof, the furnace kicking on somewhere in the basement. Josephine's beads. Joseph thought about his son. Anthony had been at the hospital yesterday, or maybe the day before. Stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets, not knowing what to say. The kid had his mother's soft features, none of Joseph's granite. He'd sent Anthony to college, thinking education would sharpen him. Instead, it just made him think he was smarter than he was. Anthony believed in shortcuts. Believed you could buy your way out of trouble, that a good lawyer was better than a closed mouth. The Las Vegas indictment had proven otherwise. Federal prosecutors don't care about your lawyer when they've got you on tape talking about skimming casino counts. Anthony had done 4 years in a federal pen, and when he came out, he'd wanted his old spot back. Wanted to be boss again. Joseph had said yes, because you don't humiliate your own blood in front of the council. But he'd also started grooming Jack. Quietly, letting Jack sit in on the important meetings. Letting Jack handle the delicate negotiations with the other families. Jack was Bill Tocco's boy, Bill, who died in 1972, the only real friend Joseph had ever had. Losing Bill had been like losing a limb. They'd opened that bakery together in 1998, two kids from Terracini who barely spoke English. They'd stood shoulder to shoulder through the Gianola Wars, through Prohibition, through the unions and the numbers and all of it. Bill had understood the rules. Bill had understood that you survive by being invisible. Now Bill was gone, and Joseph was dying, and Anthony was out there somewhere, thinking he was still in charge. The rain intensified. Joseph listened to it, drumming the windows, and thought about the men he'd killed. Not personally, he'd never pulled the trigger himself, not after 1920, but the men he'd ordered killed. You lost count after a while. It became arithmetic. A problem that needed solving, a loose end that needed cutting. You made a call, you gave a nod, and someone stopped being a problem. Chester Lamar, 1931. Joseph had arranged that one personally. Paid off Lamar's wife, sent the bodyguards home, left the front door unlocked. Mike Rubino, just a kid, 18 years old, had walked into Lamar's kitchen and put two in his head while he drank his coffee. They'd made Rubino the next day. Inducted him into the family as a reward. Joseph wondered if Rubino was still alive. Probably. Guys like that, the ones who kept their mouths shut, they tended to last. Jimmy Hoffa, though, that one still sat wrong. July 30th, 1975, 3 months ago. Hoffa had been trying to claw his way back into the Teamsters presidency, making noise, threatening to expose people. The national families had decided he needed to go. Joseph had given the nod. Giacalone had set up the meeting at the Macco's Red Fox, told Hoffa it was about smoothing things over. Hoffa had shown up, gotten in a car, and vanished. They still hadn't found the body, probably never would. The thing was, Joseph had liked Hoffa. Not as a friend. Joseph didn't have friends, not really, but as a piece on the board. Hoffa had been useful. Hoffa had understood the arrangement. The mob kept him in power. He kept the pension fund accessible. It had worked for 20 years. But Hoffa had gotten sloppy, started talking to reporters, writing a book, started thinking he was bigger than the arrangement. So he had to go. Joseph didn't lose sleep over it. You don't build what he'd built by losing sleep over the necessary moves. But lying here now, feeling his lungs fill with fluid, feeling his heart stutter and skip, he wondered if maybe there was a ledger somewhere. Not the kind the IRS kept, but the other kind. The kind that tallied everything. He'd been born Catholic. Baptized in Terracini, confirmed, the whole thing. Josephine still went to Mass every Sunday, came home and lit candles in the front room. Joseph hadn't been inside a church since his mother's funeral in 1943. He figured God, if there was one, probably had better things to do than listen to the prayers of a man who'd spent 60 years breaking commandments for profit. The door opened again. A nurse this time, the older one with the grey hair pulled back tight. She checked his pulse, adjusted something on the IV drip they'd set up, made notes on a clipboard. Her fingers were cold. "Mr. Zerilli," she said, "can you hear me?" He blinked. Once. Good. I'm going to give you something for the pain. It'll help you sleep. Sleep. He'd been sleeping too much already. Sleeping and waking and not being sure which was which. Earlier, yesterday or last week, he dreamed he was back in Terracini, standing on the dock, watching the fishing boats come in. His father was there, alive again, mending nets. Joseph had tried to speak to him, but no sound came out, and his father had looked right through him like he was made of glass. The nurse injected something into the fourth line. Warmth spread up his arm. There you go, she said. Just rest now. She left. Josephine's beads kept clicking. Joseph felt the morphine, or whatever it was, pulling him under. The room got softer round the edges. The rain sounded farther away. He thought about the bakery. The one he'd opened with Bill in 1998, right after the war. They'd worked 18-hour days, kneading dough, firing the ovens, delivering bread to the Italian groceries on the east side. Honest work, or as honest as anything got. They'd been good at it too. The bread had been good. But bread didn't pay enough. Not for the life Joseph wanted. So they'd started selling imported cheese, olive oil, the stuff the old-timers from Sicily wanted. That's how they'd met Joe Profasi, the Brooklyn importer. Profasi had taken a liking to them, two smart young Sicilians who knew how to keep their mouths shut. Profasi had introduced them to people. Opportunities. By 1920, they weren't bakers anymore. They were businessmen. The morphine pulled harder. Joseph's breathing slowed. He saw faces. Bill Tocco, young again, grinning over a poker hand. Angelo Melli, counting money at a table in the back room of the fish market. Gaspar Milazzo, right before he got shotgunned at that same fish market in 1930. Sam Catalanot, singing Sam, who'd kept the peace until pneumonia took him. All dead now. Everyone from the old days, gone. Joseph had outlasted them all. Outlasted the wars, the indictments, the investigations. The Kefauver hearings in '51, when half the mob bosses in America got paraded in front of TV cameras, and he'd stayed home, stayed quiet, stayed off the list. The Veloci hearings in '63, same thing. The FBI had been watching his house since the '50s, taking pictures of everyone who came and went, but they'd never gotten enough to make a case stick. Because he'd been careful, because he'd learned the lesson Sam Ginola never learned, it's not about being tough, it's about being smart. And now here he was, dying in a bed in Grosse Pointe, surrounded by family who didn't really know him, protected by an empire he'd built from nothing. The ceiling was getting darker, or maybe his eyes were closing, hard to tell. He heard Josephine stand up, her chair creaking, felt her hand on his forehead, cool and dry. She said something in Italian, something he couldn't quite make out. A prayer, probably. Joseph wanted to tell her he was sorry. Sorry for the distance, the silence, the 55 years of sitting at the same table and never really talking. But his throat wouldn't work. The words were stuck somewhere between his brain and his mouth, drowning in the morphine fog. She kept her hand there. He felt her thumb trace the sign of the cross on his forehead. Outside, the rain was letting up. He could hear it in the change of rhythm on the windows, the way the drumming softened to a patter. His last thought, before the darkness took him completely, was of the sea. Not the Detroit River, not Lake St. Clair, but the Mediterranean. That impossible blue. The smell of salt and fish and sun-baked stone. He was 17 again, standing on the deck of the SS Taormina, watching Terracini disappear behind him. He'd never gone back. 63 years in America, and he'd never once returned to Sicily. Told himself it was too risky, too much attention, too many questions at customs. But the truth was simpler. He'd been afraid. Afraid that if he went back, he'd see that the place he remembered didn't exist anymore. That it had never existed. That it was just a story he'd told himself to make the leaving easier. At 8:15 p.m. on October 30, 1977, Joseph Zerilli's heart stopped beating. Josephine felt it happen, the change in his breathing, the stillness. She kept her hand on his forehead for another minute, finishing the prayer, then stood and walked to the door. In the hallway, Jack Tocco was waiting. He looked at her face and knew. "I'll make the calls," he said. She nodded and went upstairs. Within an hour, the house began to fill. Anthony arrived first, his face pale. Then Giacalone, then the council members, then the soldiers and associates and hangers-on who needed to be seen paying respects. They stood in clusters in the front room, speaking in low voices, drinking coffee Josephine's sister had made. Nobody cried. That wasn't how it worked. You showed respect by being present, by being quiet, by understanding that an era had ended and the world was different now. The funeral was 2 days later at a Detroit funeral home. They kept it small, low-key. No procession, no spectacle. Mourners came in groups of 10 or 15, paid their respects, left. The FBI photographed everyone who entered. Nobody cared. Let them take their pictures. The man in the casket had spent his whole life being photographed from a distance. Why should death be any different? They buried him at Mount Olivet Cemetery on a grey November morning. The priest said the words, the casket went into the ground, and that was that. No speeches. No eulogies. Joseph wouldn't have wanted them anyway. That night, the council met at Jack Tocco's house. It was brief. Jack was the new boss. Anthony would be underboss, once some time had passed, once the federal heat from his Vegas conviction cooled down. Giacalone would stay on as street boss. The territories, the rackets, the arrangements, all of it stayed the same. Business as usual. Because that's what Joseph had built. Not a gang, not a crew, but a machine. A machine that ran on percentages and fear, and the understanding that everyone had their place and their cut and their role to play. A machine that didn't need any one man to keep running. Not even the man who'd built it. In the house on Middlesex Road, Josephine sat in the empty study, looking at the hospital bed they hadn't taken away yet. The rain had started again. She listened to it on the windows and thought about a young man she'd married in 1922. A man who'd worked in a bakery and smelled like flour, and had smiled at her once, maybe twice, in all the years they'd had together. She tried to remember what his smile had looked like, couldn't quite picture it. The rosary beads were still in her pocket. She took them out, let them run through her fingers, and began to pray. Not for his soul, that was between him and God, and she suspected the conversation would be a long one. She prayed for herself, for the silence that would fill the house now, for the weight of all the things they'd never said. Outside, the rain kept falling. The streets turned to rivers of black glass. The city moved on, indifferent, already forgetting the name of the man who'd shaped it for half a century. By morning, the rain had stopped. The sun came out. Detroit went back to work. And in the ground at Mount Olivet, Joseph Zerilli, Joseph as the Americans had called him, lay silent in the dark. His secrets buried with him, his empire grinding on without him, exactly as he'd planned.